Hello, everyone, and welcome to the first talk in the series Global Conversations on Quran Translation. So GLOCO is an ERC-funded project which has the full title, The Global Quran, and we study Quran translations, and especially with regard to their transnational dimensions. And since we are in our last year, we thought it would be nice to organize an online lecture series and to invite esteemed colleagues from all over the world to give us their perspective in Quran translation. And I'm extremely happy to have today as the first speaker in this series, Gerard Wiegers from the University of Amsterdam. I think he probably hardly needs an introduction, but I will say a few brief words anyway. He's professor of history and comparative studies of religion at the University of Amsterdam and was previously a professor at Radboud University Nijmegen and also associate professor and research fellow at the Royal Dutch Academy of Sciences and Arts. And he has researched and published widely on the history of Muslims in the Muslim West, the relationship between Muslims and members of other religions in Europe, including also modern Europe, and generally the relationship between Judaism, Christianity, and Islam in the history of Eurasia and Europe. And I think he will say a little bit more about his involvement in the project that you see here on the first slide, the European Quran Project, which is also publishing a lot of interesting things. And if you're interested in further talks in this series, I'm just going to send the PDF with the whole program in the chat. But now, once again, I'm very pleased to welcome Gerard, and I give the word to him. Please, Gerard.
Well, thank you very much, Johanna. It's really a pleasure to be here with you this afternoon in a series of talks, of which I then am the first, and I hope to raise your interest in a general way in the sort of translations that I have been working on in the last few years. As a researcher in this project, also funded by the ERC, the European Qur'an, with a quite large number of colleagues in different universities, in Naples, in Madrid, in Copenhagen, and in Nantes. And we are quite a large group of people, as I said, and we have been working on it for a number of years, and we have seen now the first PhD candidates defending their thesis. So the project is well underway, and it's really a pleasure to work within it. The project focuses on the cultural history of the Quran in Europe, and of course, translations are an important part of our work, given the fact that these translations not only were very important for Muslim communities, but also circulated, of course, and perhaps predominantly circulated among non-Muslims, and are a sign also of the study of the Quran and of Islam in medieval and early modern Europe. The project takes its point of departure again in Christian Europe, so to speak. So we don't include Al-Andalus nor the Muslim majority countries, but we look in the project especially at Christian territories from the 12th century until the middle of the 9th century onwards. And the translation I'm focusing on today is a translation that came into being in early modern Spain in the early 17th century even. And I will be making use of the publications that we have been working on here today, and going into some of the results as well of these publications. There are a number of them, but I think two are especially relevant here. That's a publication entitled The Iberian Qur'an, which takes a long-term view from the Middle Ages to modern times, which I edited with Mercedes García Renal, who is also the project leader of the European Qur'an project. And another volume published recently in cooperation with Gulnaz Sepultalina, who is a colleague at the University of Amsterdam, with whom I did a publication called European Muslims in the Qur'an, and there's also a publication by Johanna in that volume, and we're happy to see it out now. And it takes a view on Muslim communities, especially with an eye to the agency of Muslim communities in Europe and their involvement in translations of the Qur'an. We take a wide view on that subject. And I think in this sense, this second book, European Muslims and the Qur'an, is one of the books in the project and one of the projects in our entire public that looks at agency and looks at the involvement of Muslims in the translation, copying, transmitting, and interpreting the Qur'an. So these are two volumes I take some elements from in my talk. And before I start, I would like to say that I really hope that it can be an interactive talk. So if you have any questions, please let me know, and we can discuss them in the meantime. So I'm certainly not hoping to talk for some time without you being involved in the talk. I hope this is all right. If you have any questions already, please let me know. If not, then I'm going to discuss the translation and introduce it to you before discussing some elements of it. So we'll be introducing the text, and I will highlight the broader relevance, also taking into account the broader background of these translations within early modern Europe, but we will also take steps into the Maghreb and the medieval and early modern Mediterranean to sketch the context of this text. So it will be a broad talk on this manuscript, on this translation, putting it into the perspective of the broader discussions and also our broader theoretical interests. Now, what is called the Toledo Qur'an is in fact a rather curious name, which has grown in this way for a text that is kept, a manuscript that is kept in a library, which happens to be in Toledo, the library of Castilla-La Mancha, where this manuscript has been kept for quite some time, goes back centuries. It, through a noble library, came into this library, and is still kept there, is now also very, very accessible for research, especially because one of our colleagues, a dear colleague of mine, Professor Consuelo Lopez Morillas, made an extensive edition and a study of this text, which was published in a nice series in Spain, in a book series on called Biblioteca Arabico-Romanica et Islamica, which translation is really very important and serves our discussions in a great deal. So what is called the Toledo Qur'an derives its name from the fact that it's kept in a Toledo library. And if we then look at the manuscript itself, we will see that it's not really a mushaf in the sense that you would expect an Arabic text or an Arabic text with interlineal translation or tafsir, but in fact the text very much looks like a Spanish text only. And this has a lot to do with the historical circumstances in which this manuscript came into existence. And briefly, we have to say something about this. Some of you may be familiar with that background, others maybe not. But in very broad terms, when we look at the dates in which his manuscript was finished, between 2 May, well, we have 4 colophons, in fact, in it, and each colophon mentions that a particular quarter of this text was finished in May, end of May, June, and July in the year 1606. And it is a manuscript of 347 folios, but as I said, it was in that period that for Muslims in Spain it was not possible to practice their religion freely. And we are talking, when we talk about a copyist, who undoubtedly was a Muslim, we are talking about people who led a crypto-Muslim life. How did that come about? In the medieval period, you would find in the places where also this manuscript was copied, you would find Muslim communities. So in the north of Spain, and in this particular village where this manuscript was copied, Villa-Velice, I will come back to that later, you would find in the Middle Ages Muslim communities who were allowed to practice Islam as so-called mudechars, a word that is derived from the Arabic adajn and means something like people who are engaged in a treaty with the Christian majority society, with the rulers in Christian Spain. The word adajn and mudechar only enters into the vocabulary in medieval and early modern Spain very late, but we find it earlier already in Arabic sources when Muslim and Arabic authors speak about these Muslims living under Christian rule, and they speak about the Ahl Adajn. It is usually slightly pejorative because being engaged in a treaty with the non-Muslims is seen as an adaptation that has its downsides for your religious life, for your independency, for your economic life, etc. But especially, of course, for your religious life. Can you be a good Muslim when you live under Christian rule is one of the questions that has been discussed often in Muslim majority parts, and also, by the way, among Muslims in Christian Spain, it's themselves, so among these mudechars. At the end of the 15th century, when the last independent, more or less independent Islamic kingdom of Granada is conquered by the Christians, a number of forced expulsions come about. Between the end of the 15th century and 1526, the Muslims are converted under duress and are only able to transmit their religion in secret, and many do so. This situation comes at an end in 1609, when the Spanish crown decides to expel all these Muslims from Spanish soil, a process that takes place 5 years at the least, but in fact goes on for some more time when people start to come back out of that expulsion from the Maghreb and the Mediterranean. But nevertheless, the expulsion is quite complete in the sense that more than 300 people are expelled from Spain and migrate forcibly to mostly the Maghreb, to Morocco, to Algiers, to Tunisia, to a lesser extent also to Italy, and then also the Ottoman Empire, a very important place where people take refuge to. So this manuscript, in fact, if we look at the dates, was copied quite close to the date in which the expulsions began. And so must have been copied in secret, and in a sense, although it is not completely certain, we see the traces of that secrecy back in the way in which the manuscript was copied, because the copyist tells us that he leaves out the Arabic and he copies the manuscript in Christian letters, so he says, because he is short of time. Now, this may be connected to a situation of crypto-Muslimness. It does not necessarily be that way, of course, because many people may, for all sorts of reasons, be under pressure to return a manuscript if you only have it for a short time. And we see this. I will take you to a page from the manuscript. You see it in the layout of the manuscript very clearly here. Here, this is a page of one of the first colophon, where it says here I end the first quarter of the Qur'an, and then he writes in Latin script, and then sometimes goes over to the Arabic script, continuing in the Romance language, continuing to write in Spanish, and makes that interlinear with switches from the one type of script to the other. It doesn't say exactly why, but it's in any case clear that for him, using the Latin script has another value than writing in the Arabic script. So we see here the part of the colophon, as I said, and on the next page, he asks his readers that because it is written in Christian script and not in the letters of the Muslims, they don't take it against the manuscript, against the way it is copied. So he is apparently aware of the fact that using the letters, the Latin script is identified with the Christians, and the Arabic script is something that works as an identity marker with regard to the Muslims in Christian Spain. And he asks, well, don't hold it against me. And then he says something also about the fact that it's written in Romance, and he says, okay, yeah, the translation is in Romance. Don't take that also against me, because he says we know that the best language that there is the Arabic, but a good language, or in a sense the best language, is also the one that people understand. So this is something that he connects to the fact that he uses the Romance for his translation commentary. I will come back to the commentary translation question also. So we see here something that I think we also see in other parts of the Muslim world, where vernaculars are used. Often we see the use of the Arabic script, and there's often also evaluation of that Arabic script as something that belongs or is tied to the identity of Muslims. So the Arabic script as an identity marker of Muslims. So we see that in a lot of places in the Muslim world. I'm not sure that it's the only factor that decides whether people continue using the Arabic script. There are certainly also others, I think. We can discuss that. One of them being, in any case, with regard to Mudéjar and Morisco, Spain, that we see already in the Mudéjar period the use of the Arabic script for religious texts. So we see that already earlier. Also in the case of translations of the Qur'an. And here I would point to the recent thesis that was defended by Adriana Rodriguez Iglesias at our university in Amsterdam on abbreviated Qur'ans, but he explains in his thesis that this is not the correct term, convincing reasons, says we should speak of Qur'an selections. And he discusses that phenomenon and shows that you have different stages in these manuscripts, which were in fact partial selections of Quranic surahs intercalated sometimes with other texts, for example, Aqidas, in orders that themselves also shifted. And he connects the shifting functions also to particular ritual functions in the medieval and early modern period. So what is important here, what I started saying about these texts, is that they are also the translated part of these Quranic selections are written in Arabic scripts, so that we know also that the use of the Arabic script for the Romans was tied to particular educational practices amongst these mudeggars. So the voorlage of our Toledo Qur'an was in fact, and this is also told to us by the copyist, was in fact an Arabic language Qur'an with an Al-Ghamiyado commentary translation into it. But the copyist leaves it out. So he leaves the Qur'an, the Arabic text out, and he only copies the Al-Ghamiyado translations. Al-Ghamiyado is the word that is used for the Arabic script written in Romance. He takes that out and he transcribes it into a Latin Arabic text, intercalated with the use of sometimes Al-Ghamiyado, and sometimes he also uses the Arabic. So that is in fact our manuscript. As I said, copied in 1606, and we know, as I said, that it's from a Toledan library, but in fact, the manuscript was not copied there. So we don't have to do with a manuscript from the heart of Castile, but with a manuscript that was copied in the north, in Villa Felice in Aragon, by a man called Muhammad ibn Ibrahim. So I told you a little bit about the thesis written by Adrián Rodríguez Iglesias on Quranic selections. The interesting thing, one of the interesting things I should say, because there are many interesting elements in that thesis, is that this thesis for the first time makes clear that the dominant form in which the Qur'an was translated, commented upon, and transmitted is in fact the form of Quranic selections. And the form we have here, so a complete translation of the Qur'an with commentary, is in fact the exception. So we have very few of these complete Qur'an translations from medieval and early modern Spain. In fact, we have this one, and there was a previous one of which we know, namely a translation made in 1455, 1456 by a man called Isa of Segovia. So these two are in fact the exceptions to a general rule of a way of copying and translating the Qur'an, which was based, as I said, on Quranic selections. And that is remarkable, I think, but this does not mean that we don't have complete Arabic texts of the Qur'an. In fact, we do, and one of the aims of our ERC project is to make a database of all these manuscripts that were copied in Europe at the time, so between the 13th and middle of the 19th century. So it was certainly not exceptional that the Qur'an was copied in this period. I'm going to show you one of the Qur'an manuscripts that testify also to this practice. This is this one. This is folio 5, in fact, Surat al-Fatiha, where you will find an Arabic complete mushaf copied very likely in a place called Aranda de Moncayo in 1597, so only 10 years before this Toledo Qur'an, as I will continue to refer to it, was copied. And if we look at the manuscript, we see that it testifies to what I might call a rich culture, in the sense that it's complete, it's a large manuscript. It testifies to, I would say, in the very least, to a flourishing book copying culture among the Christians, in secret, in fact. So this is interesting. We do not know, this is one of the questions I think that is still before us in research, how many, in fact, of the Qur'an copies that we find in European libraries were in fact copied in Christian Spain. It is not always easy to tell. We have only a few, majority are not so easily localized or dated to be dated. But in fact, you might suppose that this has not been an exception, that we find many more of these Qur'ans copied even until the late 16th century, early 17th century even. So going back to the beginning of my introduction to this manuscript, we see that it was not unique, in the sense that Muslim manuscripts were copied. There was a continuation also of Arabic manuscripts that were copied until the late 16th century. So this asks for an explanation, of course. How is it possible that after a century of repression by the Inquisition and the authorities, there was still a flourishing book culture in this period? Well, there's no real answer to that, only that perhaps that studies on these Muslim communities shows that one of the reasons perhaps is that the internal dynamics of the communities. We see that from the south, after a general revolt in Granada, so the southern parts of Spain, many of these Granadan Muslims were expelled to the north because it was feared that they would revolt another time. So people were spread, and this brought certainly a new wave of Islamic activities with it. So we see in the end of the 16th century a sort of revival of Islam growing in the north of Spain among communities that had been quite quiet, so to speak. We do not know a lot about them. But it is clear that we have some sort of a revival. And also an element of what we can see as a revival is that we see an increasing number of manuscripts copied in that period. A number of them also written in Latin script. So we see also a shift from the Arabic script use to the use of Castilian, of the Latin script. And this Qur'an manuscript is certainly part of that group of manuscripts. And in fact, as has been pointed out by Consuelo Lopez Murias in her edition, we see a number of other manuscripts closely related to this one, among which another in the same library in Toledo, a manuscript of Kitab al-Tafrih by Ibn Jalab al-Basri, written in the same hand, and probably also in Villa Felice. So this manuscript seems to be part of a flourishing manuscript culture, but we have not been able to say, of course, so far, something about the author of this text. Now, in her edition, Consuelo Lopez Murias makes an exemplary study of how this manuscript is the translation tradition and commentary tradition is related to other texts. Now, first, something then on the translation aspect and commentary aspect. Certainly in the first part of the manuscript, the author or the copyist shows a very sharp awareness of what belongs to the Arabic text, what is more or less literal translation, and what he sees as a commentary, which he distinguishes from the translation parts by using slashes and using other colors. So black for the main text and read for the inserted commentary text. At a certain moment, he leaves that and he is more loosely working with the text. But in fact, it is an interesting aspect of this text that he tries to make a distinction between the translation and the commentaries. Now, of course, the translation is also derived to a particular interpretation tradition, and Consuelo Lopez Murillas makes clear how this interpretation tradition is part of what is more or less a familiar pattern of the use of particular tafsirs in this part of the world. So the use of people like or tafsirs as by those of Ibn Abi Zamanin and others is quite conspicuous in the manuscript, and she makes that quite clear. Also with regard to the translation parts. Interesting here, but I will come back to that, is also that the manuscript, in the sense of its ritual aspects and the formal aspect, shows very much how strongly it is immersed in the Andalusian tradition of copying and transmitting Arabic Qur'an manuscripts. So I think maybe I'll stop here to see whether there are questions so far, or things you want to ask, or where I was perhaps not clear.
I think it is very clear.
Okay.
Do we have any idea how this compares to like manuscript and translation practices in other parts of the world?
In translation practices, you mean?
Yeah, I mean how like manuscripts were written when that contained interlinear translations and or commentary.
Yeah. I don't know about precise textual references, but of course we see this in many parts of the world. And I mean, the first appearance of interlinear translations and commentaries, I think we see them in the Turkish world. In the article, in the book that we published, Gulnaz Sepultarina and myself, there is an article by her on that aspect. So it's certainly not isolated. And with regard to the selections, which are much more frequently to be found among these communities than complete translations of the Qur'an, there we have parallels, which Adrián Rodríguez explores in his thesis, where you find similar Qur'an selections, also with sometimes with translations in other parts of the Muslim world, including the Ottoman world, but also in, for example, Indonesia and elsewhere. He has explored it in his thesis, but that is certainly something that he touches upon, but can be studied much further than so far. What I think is an important marking point here is that we can establish at this moment, in any case, that this world was not isolated from other parts of the Muslim world, and that what we encounter here is found elsewhere. With regard to the formal makeup or the formalities, for example, so the distinction of the Qur'an into 27 parts to be read during Ramadan, which is typical for a Western way of transmitting the Qur'an, as shown by other colleagues, and also the fact that we have a partition into 4. Then we also have something that is, or as shown by Juan Pablo Arias in an article, something that originates in Andalus with a Mufassir called Ardani, who also wrote a lot on the Qur'an. And we see it commencing there. So we see particular habits and ways also, of course, the fact that here there is the Qur'ān of Warsh on the authority of Kalum, different from the other parts of the Muslim world. But what is important is that particular way of copying and transmitting the Qur'an spreads from there to other parts of the Maghrib. So it is in fact something that originates in Al-Andalus, spreads to the Maghrib, but then also later on other forms come into being. So that's perhaps a long answer to your question in saying that this is not an isolated world. There are certainly all sorts of parallels on different levels, on different ways of how these manuscripts are copied and transmitted. Other questions? Okay, shall I go on? Okay.
Yep.
Okay. As I said, the manuscript was copied in Villa Felice and in the north. And let's have a look at that place. This is Villa Felice today, a small village of a few hundred people. But in fact, in the 17th century, late 16th century, it was densely populated by Moriscos because when the expulsion started in 69, it appeared that about 1,500 souls would leave the village. And this was not exceptional. We find it in more of these villages in the north, where in the Middle Ages, by the way, about 1/3 of the population was Muslim, with fascinating Muslim architecture. And Villa Felice was one of those places. And here I spoke about this Muhammad, or this copyist. I will go back to it, show you here, one Muhammad ibn Ibrahim, whose child of his birth is mentioned in one of the manuscripts, and Consuelo Lopez Morias argues on good grounds that he might be very well identical with a person we know from other sources, namely a man called Muhammad Rubio, who we know him from another manuscript, which was copied in Tunisia at the beginning of the 17th century. It's a manuscript that is now kept in Bologna in the university library, and this includes a number of religious treatises and translations from the Arabic into Spanish. And here we have a page in which we see how it is asked to pray a Fatiha for the Lord, the Imam of the book, and who paid with his money for the translation from the Arabic, the Arabigo in Castellano, for those of his ta'ifa, of those of his group, as they were called, addressed in the north of Africa, his ta'ifa. And this is the man, you find his name very much below, as Hajj Ahmed Rubio Aragones de Villa Felice. So here we have this name, the man called Muhammad Rubio. He is called Hajj, so he must have been on the Hajj, and in fact this is also confirmed in other parts of the manuscript. And he was very likely someone who was well-to-do at the period in Tunis, but he came from the same village of Villa Felice, and he paid for these translations to be done from the Arabic into the Spanish for aged Moriscos who, after the expulsion, were not able to read Arabic. So we have this group also for whom works were translated from Arabic into Spanish. And this is the perhaps So our Consuelo Lopez Murias argues the same man who copied out this Qur'an of Toledo in the village of Villa Felice. It is not certain, but in any case, it shows, it is likely, and it shows how, come to a next point in my talk, how also this manuscript culture, including copying the Quran, was taken by Muslims of Christian Spain on their expulsion or their secret migrations outside Spain into the Maghreb and also into the Ottoman Empire. For we have several manuscripts that were copied in Salonika, and Salonika was a place to which not only Iberian Jews fled, but also Muslims from Iberia who settled there and continued copying the Quran and copying, or perhaps even originally translating works into Spanish for expelled Moriscos. So this brings us outside. One of the things that is certainly still to be done, because we don't know much about it, is how are Arabic manuscripts of the Quran copied by Muslims in the diaspora, as we might say. In fact, we do not know much about that. So they are principally identifiable because of their continued use of the Spanish. But certainly a lot needs to be done on Arabic manuscripts being copied among them after the expulsion. I was already saying this was we are at the end of the 16th century, beginning of the 17th century. We are seeing there a new phase, emerging commercial and intellectual networks in and outside the Iberian Peninsula, as we see, for example, in the case of this Mohammed Rubio. They take manuscripts outside, but we are quite certain that this particular manuscript of the Quran was not taken outside Spain. It must have remained there, and later on entered in this Toledo, into this Toledan library. It is seen as an important element, important cultural achievement, you might say, and people really speak about this as Muslim patrimony in Spain, because it is really a rare fact that the Quran was translated entirely into Romance, into Spanish. And here we also see tafsir elements and complete pieces of tafsir. Sometimes they are quite lengthy and clearly demarcated, sometimes also from the Quranic text. So it is an achievement. One of the things that we are still not certain about, although it seems very unlikely, is that there might be a relationship with the Quran translated by this Mudechar scholar, Isa of Segovia. Let me briefly say something about that, because the conditions under which that translation came into being are quite different from the way in which this Toledo Quran came into being. Now, the translation by Isa of Segovia came into being in an interaction with a theologian named Juan de Segovia, who, born in the late 14th century, became interested in Islam and the Quran, particularly after the fall of Constantinople. And already before that, I should say, but one of the things he struggled with and thought about was how to convert Muslims, as many others, of course, but in this case, he started to reject crusade as a way of converting Muslims, adopting another position that he saw as the way of peace and doctrine, and convinced that that was the way forward. He started looking for Muslims who could help him as he saw it, with translating the Quran, because he felt that in order to be able to convert Muslims, you would need a good literal translation of the Quran, and the existing translations that he knew about and we know about fell short in that respect. And we have the famous translation made by Robert of Ketten, subject of a recent edition, and also one of the books in the series that the European Qur'an is published, has a lengthy study about it, called the Latin Qur'an, study the influence of that particular Qur'an. There we see that this Qur'an was not literal, and fell short for the goals that Juan de Segovia had in translating the Qur'an. So he searched for someone who might do that. He encountered a lot of difficulties, but in the end, through the involvement of the Castilian king, was able to persuade this Mudéjar scholar from Segovia to come to France, where he was at the time, in Éton, small village, and he translated the Quran in a number of months, using tafsir works and other works for this scholar. But unfortunately, that translation has been lost. A few elements, a few fragments of it were found, and that these fragments, in any case, suggests that it is very difficult, if not impossible, that our copyist of the Toledo Qur'an was influenced by the Qur'an as translated by the Mudéjar scholar in cooperation with Juan de Segovia. But it sketches you the fact that it makes clear that it was rare, and that most of the translations, in fact, were partial translations. Now, coming back to the Toledo Qur'an, it was probably not influenced by that Mudéjar translation, even though we know that when he finished it, he took back a copy with him, but we don't know where it is now. What we do know, of course, in his case, in the case of the Mudéjar scholar, we know that he was also firmly immersed in Muslim culture, tradition, because of his other works that have been preserved. A famous one being a work called Breviario Sunni, which is more or less a summary of the fiqh subjects, very much influenced by such Maliki works as Ibn Abi Zayd, Ibn Abi Zayd's Risala, very much similar to that, but it also has an Aqidah in 13 articles and a few chapters on ethics and the end of time. In any case, firmly immersed in Muslim scholarship. And the same holds true for the Iberian Qur'an, for the Toledo Qur'an that I've been sketching. And as I've said, it is clearly influenced by a Mudéjar Andalusi tradition of reading and interpretation, influenced by well-known commentators such as Ibn Zamanin and others. And as I've sketched very broadly, the book has been subject of studies by Consuelo López Morillas and Juan Pablo Arias, who continues his work on the Andalusian Qur'ans as a participant in the subject. And he was the one who showed convincingly how the division into 4 parts that we find in many, or if not all, Qur'ans copied in the Western world, Morocco, and also Christian Iberia, take that from Adani, and so there is a pattern of influence in this part of the world. Now, we're certainly not at the end of the study of this text. More can be done within further study of the texts themselves, the translation, the use of the tafsir that has been done for a part by Consuelo Lopez Murias. But certainly there is more work to be done on this fascinating Qur'an manuscript that we have now. And certainly also I myself will continue work on that also in the perspective of the Mediterranean diaspora of the Moriscos, on which I'm still working. And I'm sure also Adrián Rodríguez Iglesias will continue as part of our group work on these Qur'an selections and their relationships with such texts as the Toledo Qur'an. So that is it. Thank you so far. And I look forward to your questions and the discussion.
Thank you so much, Gerard. One immediate question that I have is, can you say something about the Spanish used in the translation? So I'm asking because there's this book by Peter Riddell on the 17th century tafsir from in Malay from Aceh, which is a bit similar to the Tafsir al-Jalalain, but also has other sources. And he says that the Malay used in it is very peculiar because he tries to basically translate the Arabic syntax into Malay.
Yeah.
So he calls the language used there kind of translationese.
Yeah.
A specific register of Malay that would only be used for translating the Quran. So can you say something about whether this is the case here as well, or whether it's just a vague summary in Spanish, or what kind of language is it, and what kind of translation style is it?
I think it's, for a part, it's certainly similar. So there is a strong influence of the Arabic and also an attempt to remain faithful to that in the use of particular terms. And in the, of course, syntax. So a lot is apparently close to the Arabic. So yes, I would say that it is close to that. Yes. Yeah.
Do you also get the impression that there's some pedagogical interest, like the idea that readers of the translation should be enabled to connect it with the original to better understand the original, or is it at a point where the translator probably assumed that the readers wouldn't be able to understand Arabic anyway?
Yeah. That's a good question. I think I would say in a number of these texts, or here in this case as well, you find an attempt to invent a vocabulary, a new vocabulary in the Romance language. So it's not an attempt only to stay very close to the Arabic as a sort of aid, as a language that is only used for that. If that is maybe but there is an attempt to sketch a new to make a new vocabulary, apparently.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Thank you very much, Gerard.